Hey everybody, we are starting a new book in Bible, First Kings. We are finished with Second Samuel, and um, remember I had said before that First Samuel is basically a book all about Saul. Second Samuel is a book all about David, and then First Kings a book about the next one, which we're going to talk about. And so that should give you an indication that David's life is pretty much over. He doesn't actually die in this chapter. A little spoiler, but he's a very old man at this point. So let's discuss a little bit about it. First Kings, chapter 1, verse 1. Now David was old, advanced in years, and they put covers on him, but he could not get warm. Basically, what happens here is David is very old. He's in his 70s, and though in his 70s isn't that old for nowadays, back then, and actually wasn't that old for like Genesis, but back then 70, 80 years old is pretty old. And they were near, especially for a guy like David who spent his whole life like as a soldier battling. It did a lot of damage to his body. So he is very old, advanced in years. And he can't get warm. It's a circulation issue. He has circulation issues, and he can't get warm. And basically they search out a young woman, a young single woman, and they have him marry this woman, essentially just for her to just lay beside him and keep him warm. It's kind of like a heating blanket, an electric blanket, if you will, like put a hot water bottle in your bed or whatever to keep you warm. She essentially just lays beside him to give him body heat, and but obviously it wouldn't really be appropriate if she wasn't married to him. So they have him marry this young girl, not young girl, but like this young single lady, and she her job is basically just to stay beside him and make sure he's warm, make sure he is not cold, and so they do this. And again, this is not a good thing for David to marry more than one person. We've talked about that. That's not never God's design, but this is a common thing in the ancient world. And this is something doctors would even recommend for an elderly person. If they were very cold, they couldn't get circulation, they'd have somebody lay beside them and give them body heat. It's a fairly common thing. So this girl, her name is Abishag, the Shunammite, and she goes and does that, marries the king, and basically is essentially just a heater laying beside him, kind of have to keep her warm. And so in verse 5, we see that David is, pretty much near the end, and he's on his last legs. He's very, very limited in his capacity. Okay, and so because of this, in verse 5, we see one of his sons named Adonijah exalts himself, and he says, "I will be king," and he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. So he basically prepares how could you describe this? Like it would be like a big Bentley and a limousine of the day or something like that, where he basically makes himself very important. Now Adonijah was the fourth oldest. If you remember, the oldest was Amnon, but Amnon is not alive anymore. Amnon was killed by Absalom, right? The second oldest was Absalom, who is not alive anymore. He was in battle with David, and then he was killed by Joab. And then there was a third son, like Cherith or something like that, but we don't know anything about him. A lot of people assume he died sometime young in his age, because they never find out anything about him other than at the very beginning when they say he has a third son. So we seem to think here that this guy Adonijah, he's the next oldest. He's assuming I'm going to eventually be king. My dad's basically on his last legs. I might as well get going here and announce myself as king, kind of take the opportunity. Well, and we find out also about him in verse 6. We see a little bit more about David as a dad. I mentioned before when we were talking about Absalom, some of his failings, that he doesn't really deal with things. He just kind of lets things go. It's kind of one of the one of the ways that him being so merciful backfires is that he doesn't like to discipline his kids. It said in verse 6, his father had not rebuked him at any time. So David had never really yelled at him, had never taken him aside and told him you shouldn't do this. So Adonijah was kind of basically entitled. Entitled means that you feel like you can do what you want and you feel like everybody owes something to you. And Adonijah kind of had this feeling like, you know what, I'm going to be the next king. I'm the next oldest. I'm just going to do it. And he does this. Gets these procession, 50 men to run before him, and the chariots and everything. And in verse 7, we find out that he had made these plans with Joab, with Abiathar, the high priest, and with just Joab and Abiathar. Sorry, I thought there was a third guy. But just Joab and Abiathar, which is pretty sad because Joab was David's high commander. Who knows? Maybe he was jealous that David had made Amasa. Remember, David made Amasa general for a little while. I don't know. David and Joab kind of had their falling out as the time went on, but Joab kind of put his support behind Adonijah, and so did Abiathar. But it says, it makes special note that Zadok the priest, Benaniah, who was a warrior, and Nathan the prophet, Shimei, and a lot of the mighty men had not gone with Adonijah. They said they stuck with David, and they said, this is not right what you're doing. He's basically proclaiming himself as king without officially proclaiming himself as king, and he just assumes. And so Adonijah goes in verse 9, and he sacrifices sheep and oxen and cattle, and there's this big sacrifice, a showy sacrifice to God, being like, this is a sacrifice to start my reign, and he has a big feast. And but interestingly, he does not invite Nathan, Benaniah, any of the mighty men of David, or Solomon, his brother. He does not invite them. And I think we know why he does not invite them, because, well, first of all, the other guys know that he's not supposed to be, that he shouldn't be doing this, and so he doesn't invite them. And Solomon, his brother, he doesn't invite, because we're going to find out later that David had actually made a promise to Solomon's mother Bathsheba that Solomon could be the next king. Even though he was younger than Adonijah, Solomon could be the next king. But he doesn't invite him to this feast. So they go and have this big feast. He gets this fancy chariot and everything, and they go and have this feast, and they decide to sit down and eat this great feast where they're basically like, this is the first thing we'll do at Adonijah's reign. And so Nathan finds out about this. Remember Nathan the prophet, last time we saw him was when he confronted David and said, you are that man. He's still alive. And he comes to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, and he basically tells her, this is what Adonijah's doing. Didn't David promise the throne to Solomon? And Adonijah's going proclaiming himself as king, and David doesn't even know it yet. And so he even says in verse 10 or 11, 12, he said, let me now give you advice that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. So he knows the type of guy Adonijah is the type that's going to wipe out any potential rival. You see, actually, Adonijah is actually Absalom's brother. He's Absalom's brother, so he takes kind of after him. Absalom was kind of cruel and wicked. Adonijah's the same way. Nathan is saying, Bathsheba, if Adonijah actually becomes king, once David dies, he's going to take out any rival, including his brother Solomon, and including you, his mom, because you guys would say stuff against him. He's going to kill you. And so they go and they have this plan where Bathsheba's going to come and tell David about it, and then Nathan's going to come afterwards and tell him about it to confirm it, because they know the way David is. David just always gives his sons the benefit of the doubt. No, I'm sure he wouldn't do that. Oh, it's probably some misunderstanding, and that's the way David is. So they go and do this, and Bathsheba goes into the chamber where the king is in verse 15, and David's like, what's going on? And she explains to him that, did you say that Solomon could reign after you? Didn't you promise that? And but Adonijah has now become king, and he's proclaimed himself king, and he didn't even ask you. He didn't even know about it. And And she said Abiathar's with him, Joab's with him. But Solomon he didn't invite. Some of the king's sons, some of the rest of his brothers are with him, but Solomon he didn't invite because he knew it wasn't going to be, Solomon wasn't going to have it. And so, and Nathan comes in and says the same thing. He kind of comes in as if he doesn't know, and he comes in and goes, "Hey, king, I just was wondering." And David's like, "Yes." He goes, "Did you say Adonijah could be king?" Because he's proclaiming himself as king. He's like, "Oh, Bathsheba, what are you doing here?" So it's kind of like this thing where they both planned. They were both outside planning. Okay, you go in first and tell him, and then I'll go in, and it'll be like. And so Bathsheba goes in. Adonijah has made himself king, and Nathan comes in. "Oh, excuse me, king. I just want to let you know. Did you say Adonijah could be king? Because he just proclaimed himself as king. I don't know if you made some plans." So, "Oh, were you just saying that? Oh, I didn't realize." "Yeah, we're both here, King David." So it wasn't they were lying or anything, but they just made it more impactful by two of them coming separately than two of them coming together. And so David in verse 28, skipping down to verse 28, after thinking about it for a while, calls Bathsheba back to himself, and he says, he swears to her in verse 29 and 30 that he promises Solomon is going to be king after him and is going to sit on his throne. And he goes, "I'm going to do it today. And I'm going to do it today, even though he's not dead. He's going to make Solomon king right away." And she's obviously very happy. And David calls Zadok, Nathan, and Adonijah to himself. He already knows the three guys that are for him. He hears Joab and Abiathar are on Adonijah's side. And he goes, "All right, call Zadok, Adonijah, and Nathan," because he knows that they are on David's side. And this is his plan. He goes, "Take the servants and have Solomon ride a mule," because in those old days, riding a mule was like a very kingly thing in a parade. He's going to basically have a big parade for him. Have him ride a mule, take him down to Gihon, wherever that is, and let Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anoint him over king of Israel and blow the horn and shout, "Long live King Solomon." And then he shall come up after him, and he shall come and sit on my throne, and he shall be king in my place, for I have anointed him to be ruler over Israel. So it's like a 5-part plan. He's going to have a big parade. He's going to ride on a mule. He's going to be anointed king. They're going to blow a horn announcing it, and then they're going to say, "Let Solomon be king." And then actually another thing, he's going to sit on David's throne. So this was a big deal. And so and Benaniah and Nathan, they're like, "This is a great idea. This is great." And they all go do it, and they blow the horn. They say Solomon's king, and they walk through the whole town and everything. And meanwhile, think about what's happening right now. Meanwhile, Adonijah is at his feast. He got this feast together, this small feast with the most important guys that he thinks, with Joab and Abiathar the priest and some of the mighty men or whatever. And they're sitting down to this feast, probably all cajoling and like, "Ha ha, what's going on?" And this is great and everything, and laughing and stuff. And yes, I'm going to be king, and you can be this position, and you can be that position in my cabinet, and having this great time. They hear this noise. They're like, "What is this noise? What is this noise we hear?" This noise outside. They're probably all plotting plans of what they're going to do when Adonijah's officially king and everything. They hear this noise outside, and the whole city is in an uproar. The whole city is loud, and they're just inside around a dinner table having a feast because they're saying, "Hey, Adonijah, you're going to be the next king." But they go outside, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son, remember Jonathan was one of the spies for Absalom, and Adonijah says, "Oh, you're Abiathar's son. You must have good news, right?" And he goes, "Nope, I do not have good news for you guys." And he said, "What's the news?" He goes, "King David, your dad, yeah, what did he do?" He goes, "He just proclaimed Solomon as king." So Adonijah now, remember, he proclaimed himself. He just said, "I'm going to be the next king." He's like preparing everything. He's getting his chariots together. He has this feast where he's like talking about, "I'm going to be king," and he's making all these plans and everything. And all of a sudden, Solomon's anointed king. And it says in verse like in 45 and 46, he's telling him all the details. whole city's in uproar. They're having a big parade and everything. That's the noise you hear. Solomon's actually sitting on the throne as we speak. He's sitting there on the throne, and the king's servants are going to bless King David and make them saying, may God make the name of Solomon even better than your name. And the king bowed himself on the bed. He's basically saying, like, I am along with this. Verse 49, though. So all the guests who were with Adonijah were afraid and arose. Each one went to his own way. Essentially what happened was they heard that Solomon was on the throne, and they were like, uh-oh. Because they all, while they were at the table, felt like, ooh, this is a very advantageous place for me to be. I'm with the guy who's going to be the next king, and this is great. I'm at the table at this table with this small group of guys. I'm going to be one of his people that are probably trusted advisors. And all of a sudden they hear Solomon's actually the king, and they realize, oh, this is actually treason. I'm actually guilty of treason right now because I'm in the place of somebody who's falsely proclaiming themselves as king. And it says they all just kind of went their own way. They were like, hey, yeah, I know we're not done with this feast yet, but I think I have I think my, I gotta go, that kind of thing. And they all kind of run out and they leave. And Adonijah was very afraid as well, because what he essentially did was punishable by death. It was treason. He was going against the king's wishes and proclaiming himself as king, kind of like essentially what Absalom did. He was worthy of death, and so he went and flees and runs into the house of God and takes hold of the altar, because in ancient society, usually the altar was a place that was not allowed to have violence in it. It was like usually a place of no violence and stuff. But it's interesting because in God's law, it didn't matter if somebody was guilty. Even if he ran in and took hold of the altar, you could go in and kill him. His punishment, if his punishment was death, you could go kill him. God would have no problem with it. It wasn't like no violence is supposed to be here, so as long as you stay here, you're okay. It's God's law. You could do whatever you could do whatever was appropriate. But he goes and does this kind of ancient tradition thing, holds the altar. And it was told to Solomon, hey, Adonijah is afraid of, in verse 51, indeed, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon, for look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, and he refused to leave unless you, King Solomon, promise that you'll not put him to death. Because remember, that was something Adonijah was going to do. Adonijah was going to put Solomon to death when he became king, to make sure that Solomon didn't, claim the throne. And this is a typical thing that when a king died, a son would take over and sometimes kill all of his brothers. And so he's worried, he doesn't want to get killed. And Solomon says in verse 52, if, remember, Adonijah deserves to die. He said, if he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of his head shall fall to the earth. Because if he proves himself a worthy man, if he shows himself to be good, if he shows himself to be loyal, he'll be fine. But if wickedness is found in him, if he tries to plot and plan and sneak around and try to do some things, he's going to die. So he basically gives him a little bit of grace. Says, all right, listen, this is his last chance. He's got one chance. He's on thin ice. But I will spare him. Even though his penalty should be death, I will spare him, but he's on thin ice. Tell him he messes up once and he's done. And so the king sent them to bring him down to the altar. He came, fell down before King Solomon, thankful for his mercy. Solomon said, okay, go to your house. So now Solomon is officially the next king of Israel. So we got Saul was the first king of Israel, then David, then Solomon. And that's 1 Kings chapter 1. All right, guys, we'll be doing 1 Kings chapter 2 tomorrow. See ya.